Just before we sort of jump in, I wanted to give just a brief background to myself, so you all are aware who your speaker is today. My name is Jabir Tarin, and I am a native of Northern California here in the Bay Area. I have a sort of a dual education. Part of my education is in mental health and particularly in marriage and family therapy. And so I've been practicing currently at about for the past 6 years or so. And at the same time, alhamdulillah, I have also completed formal Islamic education at a madrasa here, and it's been a 10-year journey. But with Allah's mercy and grace, we've completed that program as well. So hopefully, we'll go into this presentation and this discussion with a relatively wholesome understanding of marriage, divorce, from both a mental health perspective, and then, of course, with elements of our Sharia and our Islamic tradition as well. And so, in line with both modern psychological practice as well as our divinely inspired tradition, we will look at understanding divorce. So, just to start this off, I think it's extremely important that whenever we're discussing a topic, what we do is we need to establish our foundations. And what I mean by that is that our foundations need to be set before we talk about any subject or discussion, so that we understand as practicing Muslims, how do we view something? How do we view divorce? How do we view marriage? How do we view children? How do we view finances? Now, if you study in a university, generally speaking, you adopt the view of the university. So your foundations to discussing finance, let's say you have a finance degree, your foundational principles of discussing finance is based on the education you received at your local university or at your university. And so when it comes to discussing marriage and divorce and Sharia, we have to understand from which angle are we going to be presenting. And I think what's really crucial, really important, is that we understand that we're not going to be speaking to, we're not going to be addressing this subject from a, motivational speaker point of view. We're not going to be addressing this from like a purely psychological point of view. We're not going to be addressing this from, pop culture and the way that the social media world views divorce and mental health. We're going to look at it from the perspective of our religion and our faith. And that's going to be the basis of our foundation. And I think that's a great place for us to start. So we have some Quranic implications when it comes to understanding, our deen as it relates to marriage, as it relates to relationships. Okay. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, specifically in Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this verse, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ شِقَاقَ بَيْنِهِمَا فَبَعَثُوا حَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهِ وَحَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهَا إِنْ يُرِيدَا إِصْلَاحًا يُوَفِّقِ اللَّهُ بَيْنَهُمَا إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا خَبِيرًا. That if you believers fear that a couple or a relationship may break up, then you should appoint and set up an arbitration, one person from his family and one from her family. Then if the couple truly want from this to put things right and make things right, then inshallah Allah will bring reconciliation amongst them. For indeed Allah is all-knowing and all-aware. And in another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ahzab, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نكحتم المؤمنات ثم طلقتموهن من قبل أن تمسوهن فما لكم عليهن من عدة تعتدونها فمتعوهن وسرحوهن سراحا جميلا. That Allah addresses the believers by saying, O believers, you have no right to expect that here in the second verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who believe, that when you marry the believing women, إِذَا نَكَحْتُمُ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ ثُمَّ طَلَّقْتُمُوهُنَّ مِنْ قَبْلِ أَن تَمَسُّوهُنَّ, then and you divorce them before having had any intimate relations with them, then there is no iddah period for you to count once the divorce is over. فَمَتِّعُهُنَّ وَسَرِّحُهُنَّ صَرَاحًا جَمِيلًا. So make some provisions for them, provide for them, and then release and release your wives in a beautiful fashion. Now, what is the objective of these two verses? You might think they're kind of unrelated. They may just be sort of, in a way, not really directly related. So first of all, how they're related is that these are ayat of the Quran that have to do with divorce. These are ayats of the Quran that have to do with issues coming up in divorce, conflict, things related to marriage, things related to divorce. That's why these verses are brought, to show that our religion and our tradition has not left any subject without some guidance or some guidelines. Okay? So I wanted us to start with this so that way we understand from what angle we have to approach this. Whenever we want, in the first ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you fear that there is an issue happening amongst a couple or in a relationship, let's bring arbiters. Let's bring people who can jump in and play the role of discussing what's going on. A hakam. A hakam is like a person who can judge on behalf, a witness who can sort of judge on behalf of their party, like you have in a court of law. And the whole idea behind this is that you have representation. Now, so interesting because it says, حَكَمًا مِّنْ أَهْلِهِ وَحَكَمًا مِّنْ أَهْلِهَا, that both sides need to be defended here. It can't just be that you take the man's word, or it can't just be that you take the woman's word, but we're asking for a hakam, a proof or a authority on both sides. If what? You fear that there is some shiqaq, there's some difficulty, there's some hardship, you fear that there's argumentation or the relationship's going, maybe out of control, so that we can get towards reconciliation. And in the other ayah, it's a little bit more detailed, but it refers to the iddah period. And the iddah period is the period in which a woman must remain aloof upon receiving a divorce. Okay, and inshallah, maybe we'll touch on these topics a little bit later. But also moving forward, there's also another angle for us to look into, and this is the prophetic counsel. Now, we of course know as Muslims that the Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam never spoke about any subject or anything except that it was divinely inspired. Those things which are recited are wahi matlu. They're known as wahi, inspiration which is recited, which is the Quran as we know it. But there's also wahi ghayru matlu. And these are the words of the Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, which are inspired, but they are not recited like we do in prayer. These are the ahadith. These are the practices or the examples in the life of the Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam. And so we understand, of course, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَنطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam never spoke except that it was divinely inspired. So if we believe in Allah, then we must also understand that what the Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam says is divinely inspired from Allah, and therefore we must take his word to be extremely valuable. Okay? And then another ayah of the Quran, Allah says, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِي يُحْبِبْكُمُ اللَّهِ. That say, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, to the people, meaning Allah is addressing the Prophet. Say to the people that if you truly love Allah, then you need to follow me. Meaning, follow me, the Prophet, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Because if you follow me, then that means you truly love Allah. So all of that is sort of just like the introduction as to why I brought this prophetic counsel, because it's extremely important that we also understand that what we find in the Quran and what we find in the ahadith of the Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam are extremely relevant, and they're extremely important for us to base the direction of our life off of. And in here we have a few sayings of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, wherein he says, أَبْغَضُ الْحَلَالِ إِلَى اللَّهِ الطَّلَاقِ. And this is something which culturally we have completely hijacked, unfortunately, and given and misinterpreted. The hadith, etc., literally says that the most hated of the halal things that a person can do is to get divorced. Okay. Now, many people have taken this to mean actually that getting divorced is hated by Allah, in the sense that if I get divorced, then Allah hates me. And I think it's noteworthy to correct that misnomer, because that's not the case. That's not what it is. The idea isn't that Allah doesn't like a person, or that Allah doesn't, you know, Allah doesn't love a person, or Allah hates a person. But actually, the commentators of this hadith further explain the idea behind this is take divorce seriously, take marriage seriously. And I hate to give this really crude example, but getting married isn't like taking a car out on a test drive. That let me see how this feels, let me see how this works. If I like it, I'll keep it. If I don't, well, then forget about it. And as we'll touch up, inshallah, a little bit later on in the presentation, we'll be talking about some really, really sensitive subjects that relate to this, okay? But the idea that marriage is not that big of a deal, that marriage is not serious, that the marriage was, that marriage is sort of just like a friendly agreement. It doesn't hold any value or anything. But we should look at marriage like a sanctified pact. SubhanAllah, I'm talking about marriage. About 1 hour ago, I literally just did someone's nikah, and I'm still at the masjid actually. And it's so important to see that, one of the attendees came up to me afterwards and said that not the bride or the groom, but someone else had said to me that I have never done a nikah in the masjid. And it feels really good because it's so somber in the sense that it's like really serious. It's really important. There's a lot of value given to it. And while we're not talking about marriage in this particular workshop, I'm going to kind of explain further this hadith that taking marriage seriously, taking the active measures to ensure that your marriage is protected and that you're doing your absolute best and that you have everything you can set up for yourself in such a way that you do consider the marriage valuable is of utmost importance, and not to play around with the marriage itself. So inshallah, we'll get into that in a lot more detail. I don't want to just be too vague about that. But moving on to the next hadith, the Prophet ﷺ mentions that ثلاث جدهن جد وهزلهن جد النكاح والطلاق والرجعة. That three things, is a hadith on the authority of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, narrated in Abu Dawood, that three things are extremely serious in their seriousness, and they're also very serious even if you're joking. And they are getting married, getting divorced, and taking one's wife back. Meaning, you cannot joke about these things and think that it was just a joke. Because whether you were serious or you're joking, that thing literally happens. Now, let me clarify, because this could be perhaps surprising to some of us. If you jokingly marry someone, I mean, I don't know how this would look like, but hypothetically, let's just say a bunch of people get together, they have witnesses, they have $50 on the table as a mahar and a box of pizza or something, and a bunch of friends are together and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, the two of us, we're going to get married. Do you agree? Yes. Do you agree? Yes. Her brother's there, wali. Yes. Do you give her away? Yes, I give her away. Here's the mahar. Here's the witnesses. And yeah, we're going to get married now. And they're totally joking. They read the ayat of the Quran, the nikah, the khutbah is read, all these sort of things. That marriage will absolutely go through, because the joking of it and the seriousness of it is all the same. Now imagine also, well, I guess one scenario also applies to the scenario of the divorce. Imagine if you were an actor on TV. Now, granted, an Islamic nikah is very specific, and chances of you having any type of representation on like a real Hollywood movie where like they're gonna fake a nikah with all the khutbah and everything is super rare. But let's just say it happens, right? Let's say it's a Muslim country, and in a Muslim country, there's a movie or a script or something where they're doing a nikah or something like that. So if they're doing a nikah or they're doing a divorce scene, and the husband and wife are either not married and then they get married jokingly, they're literally married. But let's say they're really married in real life and they get a divorce on screen for the movie. That divorce actually goes through. And of course, the last category is taking one's wife back. Okay. So it's important that we keep this in mind. When we're talking about divorce, when we're talking about marriage, these things are not a joke. Every part of it is serious. About 4 nights ago, I received a phone call, and I don't want to get into the details, but I just want to show you this, why it might sound very redundant. It might sound actually almost meaningless for me to even say this. Well, of course, marriage is serious. Well, of course, divorce is serious. Well, here's the thing. About 4 nights ago, somebody called me in a panic and he said, I gave my wife 3 divorces because she was annoying me and I thought I could just get rid of her. Well, you did get rid of her, but probably in a different way now. It is unfortunate, definitely, but that divorce goes through. And this is why we have to show the utmost consideration and care and concern when we talk about marriage and when we talk about divorce. It shouldn't be something which is sort of just like on our tongue to just joke and laugh about, and talk about. Okay. So we're going to get into some definitions now. I want to also just make an additional point. Inshallah, there will be a time, there will be a couple of different segments where we're going to actually stop and I'm going to ask the audience some questions. That's inshallah scheduled into the overall time. But you can of course send your questions over to the Wasilah chat or to the Wasilah message group, inshallah, or however it is on the chat, and then I'll kind of go through those comments or feedback, inshallah, as it comes through. That way, we get a chance to kind of have a little bit of dialogue. So first and foremost, the definitions of nikah, okay? So the definitions of nikah, okay? In order to have a valid marriage in accordance with Islamic law, now we're going to do the Islamic law definitions, there needs to be one male and one female, meaning the bride and the groom. Both parties need to have consent. Witnesses need to be present, and a guardian wali for the girl should be present. It is recommended that verses from the Quran are recited to seal the pact of the marriage agreement. This is basically what you would need to get married. Now, nikah is very easy so that zina and fornication would be made difficult. Parties must be of the age of maturity, sane, and Muslim. If one of the parties is under the age of maturity, then the parent or the guardian can vouch for the child until they are the age of puberty. Then the child will have the choice to decide whether to continue the marriage or to dispatch from the marriage altogether. And I think this is really important for us to understand that the entire process of getting married is actually a lot simpler than we think. Now, granted, this is talking about marriage. We're not talking about divorce. But here's the thing. How many times have we heard, now this is a rhetorical question, answer for yourself. How many times have we heard of marriages breaking up and ending in a divorce because of the way the nikah ceremony was held, right? Oh, the blinds weren't like this, or I don't know what this is called. It was partitions or I forgot, who cares? Clearly I wasn't very aware during my wedding. But yeah, no, like, the oh my God, what was the veils? I'm forgetting the word. Okay. Anyways, that was not done correctly. The tables weren't done nicely. The vases weren't put correctly. I don't know, you got white. I wanted off-white. You got, gold. I wanted turquoise. The idea is that how many of our marriages fall into conflict, fall into issues because of the way the nikah ceremony went. Whereas look at how simple the definitions of a nikah is, right? You don't need to, and there's another beautiful hadith, أَعْظَمُ النِّكَاحِ بَرَكَةً أَيْسَرُهُ مَؤُونَةً أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام, that the most blessed of marriages are those marriages wherein there is the least amount of expenditure within your means, within your capacity. Now, mind you, if we follow that tartib, if we follow that sort of flow, that we kept our marriages simple, we followed this process, we had our witnesses, we had a mahr, and we recited some verses from the Quran, and the marriage is over, and then the family was able to begin. Perhaps, now I'm not saying it's the answer to everything, but perhaps we can suggest that maybe the issues that some of us have had in our marriages may not have happened at all. Why? Because quite a few of us are in turmoil right now, are divorced right now, or have had issues in our marriage because of the process or what had happened at the nikah itself. Okay. And now we're going to sort of get into the definitions of divorce itself. Okay. Talaq, or divorce, right? It is to absolve the commitment of marriage in the very moment or in the future by uttering a particular set of words. Now, basically this means, because there's actually, subhanAllah, as simple as it may seem, it's not very simple. A lot of people don't understand how you offer a divorce. Okay. Many people are under the assumption that the way a divorce is issued is that you have to say the words of divorce 3 times, all at the same time, back to back. This is wrong. This is not the way that a person should offer a divorce. But before we get into that, as we will, it's really important for us to understand that the way a divorce is issued is that you say a certain phrase, you make a statement, or you text it, or you write it, wherein you essentially state that I am divorcing you or that I have divorced you. Oh, and after having uttered those words, the divorce is officiated. Okay, this is how the divorce process happens according to Islam. Now, I wanted to read this hadith. This is such an interesting hadith. I know the category is really odd, though. I mean, the titling of this, the praising of Shaytan, of Satan. So of course, it should be said, which I'm going to, that the reason why I brought this is to understand why, again, I'm emphasizing, and in my prelude, as I'm building up to this presentation, I'm talking so much about the importance of marriage and the value of marriage and why we should try our utmost. It's because we need to set, like I said in the beginning, the foundations, cementing our foundations. We have to understand what marriage is, and then we're going to get into what is divorce for us to have a really good understanding of these things. Okay, so Shaytan himself, Satan himself, aside from shirk and getting people to worship other than Allah, he gets so incredibly happy when marriages fail. Now, mind you, of course, marriages fail for multiple reasons. I don't want to ignore that, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm being very inconsiderate. Now, I completely understand marriages can fall apart for multiple reasons, but just as a point of reflection, it's also important that we understand that this is part of our tradition, that Shaitan gets so much enjoyment in watching couples or marriages fail that in this hadith, let me read it and inshallah then I can explain. On the authority of Jabir radiallahu anhu, who says that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam says that inna iblisa yada'u arshahu ala al-ma' thumma yab'athu sarayahu fa'adnahum minhu manzilatan a'adhamuhum fitnatan. يجيء أحدهم فيقول فعلت كذا وكذا فيقول ما صنعت شيئا. قال ثم يجيء أحدهم فيقول ما تركته حتى فرقت بينه وبين امرأته. قال فيدنيه منه ويقول نعم أنت. So the story goes that essentially Shaytan called his little minion Satans. So Satan, the big Satan, calls his little minion Satans. He places his throne upon the water at some unknown location, and he dispatches his minions around the world. And one of his little minions or little shaitans, mini shaitans, will come to him and say, you know, I did such and such thing today, meaning I caused this much mayhem in the world. So Shaitan says to him, get out of here. You didn't do anything. Yeah, you caused mayhem. Maybe you robbed something. You whispered in the ear of someone to punch someone in the face. You whispered in the ear of somebody to go rob that guy, to go kill that guy, to go do this and to do that. So when that little Satan comes back and reports back to big Satan says, no big deal. You didn't do much. And then one of his little minions, one of his little Satans comes to him and says, oh, today I tell you what I did. I found a couple and I did not stop pestering them and putting whispers in their heads and thoughts into their heads and doubts into their heads about each other until what? ما تركته حتى فرقت بينه وبين امرأته. I did not leave him. I did not stop pestering him and putting doubts and suspicions and worries and all these things into his head until what? Until I made him separate from his wife. And upon hearing this, the big Satan, big Shaitan, he says, he brings that little Satan close to him, meaning he brings him close to him and he praises him by saying, Ni'ma anta. Oh, how good you are. Oh, how good you are. What you've done, oh, this is perfect. What you've done excellent. You know, I'm so happy of what you've done, which ultimately is what? That he caused a separation, that he caused a divorce between husband and wife. Okay. So this again is just to reiterate this point for all of us to really understand that there's a lot of reasons why marriages fail. Certainly, absolutely. And we must be considerate of all of that. But it does not mean that we can also forget that this also exists. That Shaytan, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانِ يَجْرِي فِي الْإِنسَانِ كَمَجْرِ الدَّمِ أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. That Shaytan flows through us like blood flows through our system. Shaytan flows through us just like blood flows through our systems. And the reason why I share that is because it's really important for us to understand that there are multiple reasons why Shaytan will come into our marriages, come into our heads, and create suspicion, to create havoc, to create you to text that guy, to create you to text your old high school crush, for you to talk to so-and-so, for you to message so-and-so, for you to spy on so-and-so, for you to doubt so-and-so. And whatever the reason being, at the end of the day, Shaytan gets happy, okay? So I wanted to just make mention of that before we sort of continued on. And I wanted to share this. This is really interesting. So why don't you guys take a moment, take a look at this. I'll, of course, share this as well. But according to a recent study that the Khalil Center actually was able to pull, according to the COVID response tracking study conducted by the University of Chicago, this is such an interesting statistic. 14% of couples reported being happy since the beginning of COVID, and 31% of couples reported being happy prior to COVID. Okay, let me translate that. When COVID started, 14% of couples said, "Oh, we're happy," and 30% of couples before COVID started said, "Oh, we're happy." This is extremely alarming, actually, because that goes to show that before that since COVID started, 70% of couples are unhappy. That's what the statistic is actually saying. That's unbelievable. Well, I suppose it should be believable because there's a study done. But 75, right? Or you can say 85% of couples, 85% of couples are unhappy since COVID started. And 70% of couples are unhappy before COVID started. So we need to really pay attention to that. This is very concerning. And I think for all of us, really what we can do is we need to understand these numbers, these statistics, and do a lot of self-reflection and a lot of consideration. Now, maybe some of us are not in this presentation today because perhaps, there were some issues that we had caused or some conflict arose due to our own habits. Maybe it was because of our partners. Maybe it was due to our families why maybe today we're not divorced, today why we're divorced. Maybe why today we are, in the process of getting divorced, or there's conflict in my marriage, or I know someone who's recently divorced or whatever. Maybe it wasn't you, maybe it was them. But regardless, it's so important that we understand this. But now I also want to say something. Maybe you were the one. Maybe you got separated because of you, because of those of us who are viewing this video, this presentation right now. It's also very easy to fall into that mentality that it wasn't me. It was because of the other person. I got divorced because of the other person. But I'm not calling out anybody. But I think it's really important that we also do a self-reflection. What if it was me though? What if I'm the reason I got divorced? What if it was my habit? What if it was my problem? Maybe I cheated. Maybe whatever could come up. The fact of the matter is that we need to have that self-realization in order to have that awakening for us to then be able to read all these things or hear all these things and then bring about change. But if we're hiding the truth, if we're hiding the reality as to why we got separated or whatever had happened, maybe you're the guilty party, maybe you're not. But regardless, we need to be open about that in order for us to make this make sense. Okay? So we'll take a quick pause here. And I wanted to ask this question. So inshallah, you can ask your messages where the Wasilah Connections in the chat box. What does the label of divorced mean to you? Because we all come from different backgrounds. We all come from different cultures. We all have a ton of different experiences. So that's the first question. Now, of course, the second question is, what challenges did you face that changed the way in which you relate to yourself and others? Meaning, what challenges now, and I also want to take a step back. I should have clarified this. This doesn't have to be you specifically, meaning I'm not asking you to tell me your story, but this can be anything you may have heard from your friends, from family, people who got divorced. Maybe you're not even divorced. Maybe you just heard of things that have happened, the challenges that you've heard about in the community. So this doesn't have to be used. So I want to make this really clear that we're not ousting anyone. So anyone who communicates or shares, they're not necessarily speaking about themselves, but just our thoughts. We're having an open, frank discussion. So what does being divorced mean to you? And number two, what are the challenges that oftentimes people who are divorced face? So let's just take maybe 5 minutes, write out your questions, inshallah, so we can have our discussion, or questions or answers, I should say. And then we'll kind of have like a short, maybe I'll read some of them and just kind of talk about that. We'll just take a few short minutes. Maybe I'll share something. One of the things that, of course, oftentimes, when people think of the label of being divorced, it means failure, that I failed in my marriage. It means that I didn't try hard enough. It means that if I wasn't a good, if I was a better person, I wouldn't have gotten divorced. And this is very tragic that a person would come to a conclusion in this way, to think that way about themselves. The reality is that's not, of course, the case. Of course, this is not the case, that a person would be, considered a bad person. Would this be considered that you failed in your marriage? No, like I said earlier, there could be a ton of reasons why marriages end. But we should not allow the stigma publicly that exists regarding this concept of divorce or separation to be the single definition that we attribute to ourselves. So it's really important that we pay attention to that. Okay. I know another comment came in. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a couple that said broken family, broken home. Divorce means I feel unattached to the person I love. And the recent comment as well means that someone went through the most painful experience, but still is able to push through and have hope and faith in Allah.
Okay, mashallah. That's a really, really positive one. I've never, for a first definition of divorce, that's really hopeful, actually. I love that definition. And I would love that other people have that same definition. It means that someone went through the most painful experience, but they were still able to push through and have hope and faith in Allah. If that's what divorce means to you, I mean, mashallah, that's a very resilient definition. And I think that's an excellent way of looking at it, because if we can maintain that level of resilience through these difficult moments in our lives, then yes, definitely, then learning, educating ourselves, doing more, so that for whatever next experiences or journeys that come our way, we would be absolutely ready to handle them. Okay.
A couple more came in, which was wanting a divorce as being selfish and not considerate of others. And I think that was one that came in.
Okay, got it. I think another comment came in saying about there being programming or not enough programming for single parents in the community. Well, mashallah, I encourage you and I welcome you to join Wasilah, and stay in tune with the programs and activities and the events that we hold, and kind of all the subscribe to our email list if you haven't already, as kind of one of the goals of Wasilah is to really provide this space for these type of things. Actually, and this is kind of one of the reasons why this particular workshop is so meaningful to so many of us, is because we realize that it's really hard to be alone. It's really, really hard to have to face all these challenges by yourself and not have a network. So the website is there, inshallah. Thank you all so much for your responses. Inshallah, let's go ahead and continue. We have a few more slides like this. So inshallah, we'll have other moments where we can take a quick pause and then we can continue, inshallah. I'd love to hear your feedback. All right. So now at this stage, I like to sort of begin the introduction to divorce. Yes, this may be a little technical, but that's okay. Okay. If this goes right past your head, that's also okay. The idea is that we're just sharing some information with you. We want you to be aware of it. This is how things exist. These are how things, this is how things get processed. And it's essential that we have that knowledge and that we acquire that knowledge. Now, I will also add, in terms of the religious implications here that we're going to discuss, are based on the jurisprudence and fiqh of the Hanafi madhab. And if there's anybody who doesn't maybe align with that, that is totally okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to message us at the website or at our Wasilah email, which I'm sure is there. But please email us there. We have religious consults. We have imams and scholars who can certainly assist you if you don't share the same fiqh, etc. But I just thought I'd share that in case anyone had any questions, sort of where this is coming from. All right. So now I'm going to go over the different types of divorce. Okay. The first type is a khula. And a khula is negotiating a financial agreement to separate that is mutually agreed upon. Sort of what this looks like is, if you want to get divorced, but let's say the husband disagrees, you can say, well, if I gave you $5,000 or if I gave you $10,000, upon receiving the funds, do you agree to divorce? Do you agree for that to equal a divorce? And he says yes. The moment that transaction is completed and it goes through, the divorce is officiated. This is called a khula. Number two, a fasq is reaching out to an Islamic tribunal to annul the marriage. Now, what a fasq looks like and what is a tribunal? Essentially, you would go to the qadi or the judge, and the judge would hear your case. And based on your case, the qadi would then dissolve the marriage. But because living in the West, we often, I would be surprised if we had, but we don't have an Islamic judge. We have what's called a tribunal or a Sharia council or a council of scholars. And as the council of scholars, oftentimes 40, 50 plus members of this council of scholars will review a client's case. And upon assessing all the factors that they reasonably can, will then, with the power invested or vested in them as ulama and as a body of ulama scholars, can then nullify and dissolve that marriage. This is called a fasq. Okay. Number three, the death of a husband. If your husband passes away, of course, this also classifies as a separation in marriage, obviously. Number four, disappearance. If a husband or the husband disappears for more than 4 years, then the tribunal or the body of scholars will then nullify the marriage. And the idea behind this is that if you have completely lost contact, there's no way to find this individual, and you're married, the expectation is not that you just wait till you die and that's the end of that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the Sharia is very vast and it's very broad, and it includes a lot of this leeways in there for individuals who may be in a very peculiar situation. Number five is the wife's premarital right of divorce. Okay. And kind of what this essentially means is that at the time of the nikah, if the man decides to offer the authority that his wife may issue a divorce, then she gets one verbal divorce that she can initiate at any time, and that will be a divorce in Islam. But that sort of authority is given to the wife at the time of the nikah. And number six is the standard practice of issuing a verbal divorce from the husband. And upon the issuance of that divorce, that the husband says, by making an utterance or a statement, then that divorce is officiated and the marriage is annulled. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Obviously, I share this not for the purposes of, a narcissist or sort of a psychopath to take this and then weaponize the marriage, weaponizing your resources and saying, oh, I know the fifth, give me money or do this or do that. No, the idea is that you need to become educated, and all of us as a community need to learn what the rights are that are gifted to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through this beautiful Sharia. Okay. Now, there are different ways of actually going about. Now, those are the types of divorces. Now, there's a certain way that you can actually navigate that divorce. Okay. One way is by saying you are divorced clearly, and that is known as a sarih or an explicit divorce. Okay. Now, this is one way of issuing that divorce. But there's also a different way that is maybe less common, and that is known as kinaya or kinai, which is sort of like a metaphorical way or a less obvious way. Okay. And the way essentially that you go about issuing that divorce would be to utter a statement which is not necessarily exactly clear that what you're trying to say, but it can be taken in more than one way. So, for example, if you are in an argument and husband and wife are in an argument, and they finally, and one says to the other, like here, the example is, leave me alone, or go to your mom's house. I never want to see you again. And they meant by that, you're divorced. this can actually fall as a divorce. Okay? This can actually become a divorce. But if you said that and you were not thinking in your mind, the intention was not, divorce, you were just annoyed or frustrated, like, go to your mom's house, you'll relax there, or, don't bother me right now, go away, leave me alone. Just you said it because you are frustrated, or you said it out of place, but you did not actually intend divorce, then in this case, it will not fall. But if you did intend divorce when you said those comments, it can actually fall as a divorce. Okay? And so let me also clarify that in the sarih, the explicit divorce, the moment that it's issued, the moment the divorce is issued, one divorce happens and it's considered a retractable divorce. And that retractable divorce means that you can take your wife back. And one non-retractable divorce would be if you said it in this kinai fashion, or in this sort of metaphorical fashion, it becomes a ba'in divorce, which essentially means you need a new nikah in order to get that person back, to renew your marriage. Okay? Ways to officiate the divorce. Okay? So we're going over ways to officiate the divorce. Now, it should also be said, let me see. Okay. There's 3 different ways that a person can offer the divorce or issue the divorce. Okay. Number 1 is considered the best practice, ahsan. And that is to say that a man divorces his wife one time while she's in a state of purity, not on her period, wherein he has had no intimate relations with her, and that he allows her to complete one entire menstrual cycle. So for every stage of purity, you offer one divorce without having sexual relations with her. This is considered the best. Why? Because a person has not had sexual relations, he can have sexual relations, and that if he's going to wait that long, where it's 3 separate stages of purity, this means that the decision was very, very considerate. The decision was very concrete. There was not emotional factors. There was not other factors. And that this was a very direct message that I'm willing to wait, whatever that period of time is, for 3 separate states of purity and not have sexual relations with my wife to offer a divorce in each period. This is a very considered and calculated move. And it's considered the best way to do it. The second, which is considered the sunnah method, or the acceptable method, is that a man divorces his wife in each state of purity across 3 different menstrual cycles. Okay? So I should clarify, sorry. The first period, the first process, ahsan, is that he does it one time in one menstrual cycle, in one purity cycle. In a state of purity, he offers one divorce and he tells his wife that you are divorced. Okay? And then he doesn't have any intimate relations with her. And he allows that one entire period cycle to be completed, after which then he can no longer be with her. Okay? Because when you offer the divorce, you have one full period cycle to take your wife back after one initial divorce, because it's retractable. You can actually get her back. But if you don't get her back and you just let the time run out, this is the way you absolve the marriage. However, there's a second method, which is the way that I had first explained it, which is that for every cycle of purity, you give her one divorce, and you give another divorce, and you give another divorce. Okay? And then the third is called bid'ah or bid'i, and that is the disliked approach. And you essentially, it's considered disliked, and you essentially offer all 3 divorces at one time in one statement, and you sort of do it suddenly or immediately. What ends up happening here is that you offer all your 3 talaqs, because as we understand, a man has 3 divorces that he can offer. And if he says all 3 at one time, then the nikah is invalidated. Okay? So these are the 3 different ways of actually going about that process. What does that look like? How can that happen? All right? And it's very important that we also understand that this doesn't happen there's, and actually I don't want to bring up the issue about 3 divorces equaling 1 divorce, etc. But I do want to mention that it's always best to follow this this process where you offer like the step one, because, and this is the reason behind it. If you offer one talaq, one divorce, and you just say one time, I divorce you, while she's in a state of purity, and you let the time run out, and that you're, you're not married to her, then you can always get her back. Okay. You can always get her back if you wanted to, and you can always remarry her. It's a retractable divorce. In the second process, in the second method, actually, we're going to cover that in a few slides, but just to kind of give you an idea, you're offering one divorce in one state of purity. Now, technically, you can retract that and get her back, but you wait until the second state of purity. So she goes through purity, a menstrual cycle, then another stage of purity. Then you offer a second divorce. Now, after offering a second divorce, it's no longer retractable in the sense that you can just go and, give her a hug and everything's fine. After the second divorce is issued, you need a new nikah altogether in order to take your wife back. But you wait that period out. Then you go through another menstrual cycle, then another state of purity, and then you issue the third talaq. After the third one, it's official, and there is no reconciliation. Okay. So anyways, that's just explaining the process. Now, another set of questions. What are some ways you've heard a divorce being communicated? All right. So type your questions in or send them in. But what are some different ways that you've heard of or that you are familiar with, different ways that people have offered or issued a divorce? So let's just take maybe another 3 or 4 minutes and take a couple of answers, your guys' thoughts, your experiences, perhaps, that you've heard.
There was a question that came in on, do you need witnesses to officiate any of those divorces?
No, you don't. You don't need them, but some scholars do encourage it just so that it's substantiated. Yeah.
A comment came in, I don't want to live with you anymore, was one way of it being communicated.
Okay. So I don't want to live with you anymore. So that would be like the metaphorical kinai version, because you'd need to find out exactly what that means, because I don't want to live with you anymore. You're so annoying. You're obnoxious. You're driving me crazy. All types of statements like that, quite hurtful, but they ultimately all give the same meaning, which is that, get away from me. But if it was intended with divorce, then of course, right? Yeah.
You are free from my nikah.
Okay.
I never want to have intimate relations with you.
Okay. All of these are very similar. Yeah.
And then, saying divorce 3 times in a very angry state.
Okay. So that would definitely be direct, right? That would be extremely direct. That would be very direct or very clear. I mean, of course, that's not the best way, because remember, that was the bid'i, the disliked style. Yeah.
Yeah. And if someone says they don't want to live with you anymore, does that constitute as divorce?
It can be if their intention was divorce. Remember, that wasn't the study. It wasn't directly clear. That wasn't like saying I'm divorced. But if you were saying it, with the intention, like, I don't want to live with you anymore, or I don't want to be around you anymore, etc., then yes, of course, that with the intention of divorce, this would qualify as a divorce.
And then another one, calling the spouse's parents and telling them that he or she wants the divorce.
That would not be a divorce unless someone said that. So unless someone actually communicated that, unless someone actually said that, the words of divorce, just saying I want a divorce doesn't constitute a divorce. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then last one is, if someone thinks in their head that they divorce you and the divorce happens between...
Sorry, say that again. If someone said what now?
If someone in their head thinks that they divorce their spouse, that the divorce happens between them, that's...
No, if you think in your head you did, then no. That's just waswasa. That's sort of just intrusive thoughts. That's something you don't want to pay attention to, right? Okay. All right. So I think, inshallah, we can continue. We'll just do a few more slides, and because we're in California. Maghrib is actually either about to be in or is in now. So we'll do just a few more slides, inshallah, and then we'll go ahead and take a short, maybe 5-7 minute break for Maghrib Salah, and then we'll join us. So we won't close out anything. People will just be right back. Okay.
Yes.
So let me just get to the next. Yeah, go ahead.
At that time, everyone can write in their questions as they wait and as they come back.
Okay. All right, great. So we'll just do 2 slides, California law and divorce, and then Islamic law and divorce, and then we'll take a short break, inshallah. So California law and divorce, this is really important to understand. California is a no-fault state, which essentially means that anybody can file for a divorce, male or female, as long as they pay the processing fee, okay? This is actually going to get into something that we're going to be talking about in the very next slide, but it's important that you understand that. It's not like, how in Islam, the man is the one who can initiate the divorce verbally, and the woman has these other processes that she needs to follow. California law, with regards to divorce, is that you just utter the, you just apply for the application, or you submit the documentation necessary for the divorce, and anyone can do so. Okay, once the paperwork is filed, you can be served the documents to appear in divorce court or settle internally. It's sort of kind of what the process is. Really black and white in that regard. Now, of course, it can get extremely complicated when there are assets involved, when there are children involved, when there are all these other factors. It can really convolute this entire process. But at its base level, this is what you can expect. This is what you can anticipate when you're exploring California law. All right. And as we look into Islamic law, like I mentioned, only the man can give or initiate the divorce in the traditional sense, which, like I had said, was in utterance of the 3 words of talaq, by uttering talaq 3 times. Okay, with the exception of the aforementioned methods, the method stated herein is the most common method of issuance of divorce. Meaning, that list of 5 or 6 different types of divorces that I shared with you, fasq and khula and death and disappearance and all of that, those are processes that the woman can certainly take. But the most common that many of us sort of immediately think of when we think of divorce is through the issuance of the words of divorce from the man. Okay. And so that's kind of the idea here. And this is just at a base level, purely talking about how to offer the divorce, how to initiate the divorce. All right. Okay. So this slide right here, different methods of expressing the intent to divorce. So now, of course, when we talk about divorce, the thing is that we did express how you have to utter it, and you say it. It's the most common form. But one of the any mode of communication can actually be utilized for offering a divorce. All of these here, okay, can be methods by which a divorce is given over the phone, through text, through social media, jokingly, like we talked about. And then this last one, intentionally trying to mispronounce words as a form of intimidation or as a form of just trying to be funny. This all qualifies in the same exact way as issuing a divorce. So what I mean by that is, obviously the word talaq is with the ta, lam, alif, qaf. But if you try to pronounce it differently, like talaq or talaq, which obviously is not the right saying or spelling of the word, this will still constitute a divorce. Again, going back to our original idea that don't play around with the divorce, okay? So now going into the different classifications or types of divorces, okay, I will do a brief explanation on this. Raj'i is a type of divorce where when you issue one divorce, it's an actual divorce that you can take back. Ba'in means it's the type of divorce after uttering divorce twice that in order to be with your wife again, you need to have a new nikah, tajdidun nikah. You need to have a whole new nikah. Number 3 is known as ghalidha, or the type of divorce in which you uttered the words of divorce 3 times, which permanently bans you and bars you from remarrying that woman again. And for the sake of educational purposes, I will just share this last category. It is not a common one, but it is known as halala. And halala is one exception to the rule when a person completely loses all chance of remarriage after issuing 3 divorces. The ayah of the Quran says, فَإِن طَلَّقَهَا فَلَا تَحِلُّ لَهُ مِن بَعْدُ حَتَّى تَنْكِحَ زَوْجًا غَيْرَهُ. And what this essentially means is that you cannot marry now your wife again after you've divorced her 3 times, unless she has married another spouse. So if you've divorced your wife 3 times, in order for you to get her back, on her own time, she can marry someone else. And upon marrying marrying someone else, if that marriage, that second marriage, ends up falling apart on its own, now not stipulated, and then you remarry her, then this would be acceptable. But you cannot schedule it, you cannot time it, you can't contract it. It has to happen almost serendipitously, sort of randomly, in order for that to qualify. Now, of course, that's very difficult to do if you can imagine, to be in that position. Now, this is a question that I want to get to, but I think just because of the sheer number of questions that we have coming in, I'm going to go ahead and skip this one and just sort of continue. So this is a really interesting topic. And I think it's really important that we sort of take a moment to explain this. A secret nikah is a sort of, unfortunately, like a more modern day phenomena, because it's something that, it's something that people take advantage of. Unfortunately, it's things people do because they know one or two things. They know a few things about the fiqh. They know a few things about marriages, but unfortunately, it's abuse. And I want to just take a moment and explain this. So what is a secret nikah? Okay. A secret nikah is essentially, the process wherein a person is being taken advantage of by not having any of their family, none of their responsibilities, not a mahar or anything present, and they're just married off, and they're left to do the marriage on their own, or to be in a possession of another person, or in the marriage or in the responsibility of another person. And what ends up happening is all their rights are left unfulfilled. And unfortunately, usually in that position, they are taken advantage of sexually, and none of their other rights are fulfilled, and they're not a partner in the marriage. They're not a wife. They're not an active member. And usually it's entirely and alone and clear and explicitly for the purposes of sexual gratification. So that's sort of the process. That's sort of what a secret nikah is. Now, is it halal or is it haram? The reason why I didn't want to actually get into that specific discussion is because if you look at it literally, what happens in a secret nikah is that all the stages of getting married are technically there, but there's a lot of hidden elements to it. There's a lot of non-fulfillment of rights. There's a lot of abandonment. There's a lot of people not being held responsible, but the actual technical part of the marriage is completed. There is no social accountability. It's done in secret. The man is able to carry on as if nothing has happened. The marriage continues. And ultimately what happens is that the person is held on this idea that something will happen, but they're left hanging and their rights are continuously left to remain unfulfilled, unfortunately. Okay. This is the dilemma of the secret nikah. Now, of course, there are some great resources that we can tap into, and inshallah, I want to do so. But of course, this is actually a very detailed process that I don't think this is necessarily the place for it. But I still wanted to bring that to everyone's attention to understand that this is also a major dilemma and a major concerning area. Okay. This next few slides are actually really, really interesting. So many of us have heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there's a classification. Now, this is not a formal diagnosis, but there's a particular researcher who has been doing a ton of work, Karen Rodman, and her work has a lot to do with relationships and the harms that come from relationships that sort of fail. One of the ways that these marriages fail, one of the most significant ways that a marriage fails, is, or some of the symptoms that come as a result of a failed marriage, is the amount of sort of PTSD related symptoms a person feels, which are much more heightened, however, in the relationship after a traumatic break. Okay. And there's layers to this. Okay. But the idea ultimately is that And now this is a lot to read, so of course you could take a look at it and read some of it if you'd like. But what I want you to take away from this is that there are so many harms that come as a result of failed marriages, bad relationships, failed communication, and poor communication, etc., that the divorce itself can shatter your entire worldview of everything until you rebuild again. That's how serious this is. Literally, things as simple as I want to go get coffee at the local coffee shop. It will shatter your view. No, there's going to be people there. What if people know who I am? What if people hear about the divorce? What if all those people know about my divorce? Then they'll think I'm stupid. Then they'll think that, how could you let your marriage fail? Now, the idea is that this can be a consistently harmful process for a person to entirely lose themselves until now, mind you, they rebuild that again. But that's very difficult to do so if you don't have that support, if you don't have that resilience, if you never learn those necessary skills. Okay. They have a ton of anxiety, as you'll see here. This is further explanation, but I just wanted to read one part of this specifically, which is that the breakdown of that individual person's knowledge of their sense of self or the sense of the world around them becomes completely just obliterated. Everything you once knew can become shifted or altered or messed up altogether after having gone through a traumatic experience or a traumatic relationship. Okay? It can cause psychological instability, can cause major mental health illness to occur because of the inability to process the expression, the emotions and the feelings and that relationship. Okay? You can, at times even, and this is very sad and it's quite unfortunate, but at times it can actually even lead to a completely just dystopic worldview to the extent that you yourself may become very incoherent. And that's very sad, okay, as a concept altogether. That there are people in this world, maybe us, maybe others, who can harm and hurt another person so much that it can lead to this type of reaction. Okay. And there's so many issues that come as a result. Sometimes our families push remarriage too soon. So maybe you were able to end the divorce amicably, but because our families pushed it too soon to remarry, that triggered all of the difficulties and the trauma. Not understanding that our relationships take time to heal. Sometimes you don't get closure. This is one of the most difficult things that I've heard in my 6 years of practice, not getting closure, why they left me, why, things ended the way that they did. Maybe you can't find time to move on. Maybe you can't find a way to become resilient, but it takes time. That's the idea behind it, right? But if you don't give it that time and you rush it and you're not healed yet, you can actually layer that trauma. And mashallah, Sheikh Kamran, he actually mentioned the story of Mughith and Barira radiallahu anhuma earlier. He said, is that a command that I have to marry my husband and remarry him? Or is it my choice? And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, it's your choice. So she said, I don't want to marry him. So acknowledging that, this concept, this idea that there is a choice, that there is an element of having time. If I was in a traumatic relationship for years and then it ends, do you think I'm going to necessarily be ready? Some people might actually be ready. But again, the idea is that working with the individual is different than sort of shoving a person into that, into a place where they may not belong. Okay. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about the post-divorce rights or wrongs. What sort of things are responsibilities? What sort of things do you have to worry about? What are some things that you shouldn't necessarily worry about? What are some things that you can pay attention to? What are some things you don't have to pay attention to? All of these things are extremely important. During the iddah period, right, when a woman is divorced, the woman may stay in the home of her husband to complete her waiting period. She is afforded money for her expense, a home, and clothing. Oftentimes, people tend to think that when a woman is divorced, she needs to leave her husband's house immediately, whereas that's not exactly the case. there is a waiting period. Yes, she's not your husband, she's not your wife anymore, but she's also still technically your wife until the iddah is over. After the iddah period, however, she is considered an independent woman, and as a result, would need to exchange or arrange her stay outside of the home. Okay, and this is something which is really important because oftentimes we don't remember that at all. A lot of times we do things where we think that a person, is always dependent upon her husband for all expenses. Now, we're going to get into very specific things related to, what types of expenses that need to be spent, what type of expenses don't need to be spent, what should you or what do you have to. We're going to get into that as well right now, inshallah. So, but what about our in-laws? Okay. After the divorce is officiated, there is no Islamically obligated rights for the in-law to fulfill with the previous family, meaning you wouldn't need to fulfill with your in-laws. Visitations can be arranged based on amicable terms, but that doesn't necessitate a shari'i requirement, like a deeply religious requirement. Okay. As for your partner, okay, the financial expenditure is mandatory upon the father for his young, not yet mature children. And as for the stepmother and stepfather, they do not need to manage the financial expenses, fatherly or motherly nurturing, or mandates of the children. Adopted children will need to make appropriate segregation after adulthood. Biological children will not. Okay. So if you marry another person who has adult children and you have adult children, so there is a element here that needs to be taken into consideration. The daughter, let's just say, for example, the father has adult sons and his new wife has adult daughters. After the marriage, the daughters and the new husband are like biological father and daughter. However, the adult sons and the adult daughters must separate from one another as they're not mahram to each other in the marriage. Okay. Children go to, now this is child custody. I want to make it very clear that child custody is not cookie cutter at all. It's very complicated. It's very complex. There's a lot of factors. I'm only sharing the bare minimum text, the details of which, of course, you can discuss offline or with a consultant directly. Children go to the mother is the most entitled to take care of the child. The mother and the grandmother have the responsibility of raising the child, both male and female, until puberty. Once the male child hits puberty, the father will step in to raise the child with his fatherly tarbiyah and nurture. And when the female child becomes capable of eating, dressing, and using the washroom on their own, the mother is the most capable of managing the affairs and the adab, or the etiquettes of young women. And when she becomes an adult, the father will be her caretaker. And financial responsibility, the financial expenditure is mandatory upon the father for his not yet mature children. Now, let me clarify here one thing. While this does associate an attribution to very specific groups of people, I want to make sure it's very, very clear that this will also be based on the degree of preparedness, maturity, readiness of the parent as well. Just because the father is stipulated here or the mother is stipulated here as sort of like the standard go-to doesn't mean that that's going to be the case all the time. As we know in the real world, there are very, very obvious instances where this does not happen, where the mother is not fit to be taking care of her children, or the father is in no position to watch his children. Okay. So when we talk about social media, what's also really important is that social media is a great tool to reconnect, but also remember, social media you don't have privacy once you post things on social media. And so with that, if you're going through a divorce or you're going through difficulty, thinking that social media is going to be your outlet might be a huge mistake, because it might not actually be the best place for you to express yourself, because you put yourself out there in a position to be very vulnerable. When it comes to family engagement, again, our families are a great support structure, but they can also be a very, very problematic support structure to share everything with. As someone once said, your best friend can hurt you and you might forgive them, but don't tell your parents that your best friend hurt you, because your parents will never forgive them. Okay. Now, granted, that's just a saying, but the idea still remains. If you need to share with your family, be considerate of what you're sharing, how you're sharing it, how you're getting that message across. Why? Because if you argue, or if you have children, or people are watching you, your relationship with your family about your ex or about your other partner is going to shift their worldview. It's going to shift the way they perceive things. It's going to shift the way they see things. It's going to change the way that they perceive their family, their elders, their relatives. Okay. Some people have asked this question: when is the right time to talk about divorce? When is the right time to talk about things related to divorce? When is the right time to, is it considered ghiba to talk about divorce? So I wanted to mention that in Riyadh al-Salihin, a very great compilation by um, um, Sheikh al-Sabuni, he mentions that there are 6 areas. It's actually a hadith that mentions 6 areas in which it's okay to talk about another person. So your husband, your wife, your children, your in-laws, it would be acceptable. Number 1 is if you're complaining about an oppressed or someone causing oppression. Number 2, you're seeking the aid against a wrong that took place. Number 3, if you have a question and you need to ask a detailed question, you might have to include people's names, story, narrative, and in that instance, it would be okay. Warning another Muslim about the harm of another Muslim or another person. If there's active harm, it would be totally permissible for you to talk about that person's case. Let's say there's a predator in the community marrying off dozens of women causing harm. It would be necessary to talk about that person to the relevant authority. Number 5, someone who sins publicly. So if there's someone that everybody knows and he's a very well-known individual, he's very sinful, or he talks about things that are not permissible, for you to then share that information or to talk to someone about him would not be considered a ghiba, because that person does these things openly. And lastly, the title. So to call someone by a title, sometimes we give people odd nicknames like, hey, blind one, or hey, fat one, or hey, so-and-so, or so-and-so. But to call someone by that nickname, there would be nothing wrong with that. And this is because a lot of people do have irrational fears about, unfortunately, falling into riba or, ranting about a person where it's not acceptable. But in the time of need, it's necessary. This is just like a slide I thought that would be relevant as we are about to talk about how marriage, divorce affects us. For example, there are a lot of different ways. You guys, I'm not going to read through this. You can certainly take a look at it. There's a ton of different ways where divorce can impact you. But one thing I wanted to make certain is that, maybe getting divorced isn't the answer. Maybe getting divorced isn't going to make you better than being in that relationship. We sometimes create this idea, this wrong idea that maybe if I got divorced, things would be better. That, my husband, all he does is nag me all day. All he does is ask for this and that. My wife, she constantly says, get a better job or do this or do that. And it's just, 30 years of that or 10 years of that. It's just, I don't know. I feel like if she just wasn't there, I would be much better off. Look, the cold, hard truth about that is that in a lot of instances, that's not the case. In a lot of instances, getting divorced is actually a lot harder. It's a lot more complicated. People do feel a lot worse. And it's really important that we keep that in mind. Okay. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it. I'm saying that don't think of it as your get out of jail free card. It doesn't necessarily mean life's going to suddenly become great again. You should expect that a reasonable amount of difficulty and challenges will come with that. But it's a really good reminder for all of us to be very considerate about that. Okay. So there's a great amount of taboo and social dilemma. Of course, we recognize this. We know this. Of course, you guys can take a look at this, but I'm just going to share a few things off the top. When you get divorced, there's all these things about our honor, our izzah, our honor. And a lot of these are cultural. Actually, most of this is cultural. Very little about this has anything to do with religious implications. Most of this is social and cultural dilemma. Okay. About, what are people going to say? And, how's this going to make us look? At the end of the day, honestly, if we can just find a middle ground to get past that discussion, either, you talk to a mental health professional, you speak to an elder in the family, you speak to someone you love or respect or treat with, someone who treats you fairly, despite what you're going through, a good friend. All of these factors are relevant, necessary factors for you to create before you sort of get in that position. At the same time, however, putting yourself in a position to be ready that if, you are in that predicament, that you know who to turn to in order to avoid a lot of these social and taboo dilemmas or obstacles that might come your way. Okay. And this is such an interesting story. And the reason why I wanted to share this is because um, basically there was a young woman whose father wanted her to get married. And she said, no, until I know what the rights of my husband are over me, I don't want to get married. So the father took her to the Prophet ﷺ and said, this is my daughter. She doesn't want to get married. So the Prophet said, hey, listen to your father, get married. So she said, oh, Messenger of Allah, I want to know what are the rights a husband has over me. So then the Prophet ﷺ listed the whole thing about the rights of husband over the one's wife. So what did she say? She said, وَالَّذِي بَعَثَكَ بِالْحَقِّ لَا أَتَزَوَّجُ أَبَدًا. She said, I swear by the one who sent you as a messenger of God to all of mankind, O Messenger of Allah, I'm never going to get married. After she heard what the rights of husband are over wife, she said, I'm never getting married. So what did the Prophet ﷺ say to her? فَقَالَ النَّبِيُّ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ لَا تَنْكِحُهُنَّ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِنَّ. That do not marry, he said to the father of the girl, do not marry off your daughter without the permission of your daughter. And this further just supports our idea here that we have to be really, really aware and considerate of the fact that there are certain things, certain people are not ready for marriage. Certain people are not prepared for it. Certain people have had traumatic experiences. But our tradition, our religious tradition, grants scope for those individuals. Whereas our culture and oftentimes a lot of the taboos that exist are all man-made. And unfortunately, we just make it difficult for our own selves. So this is a great list. I really want you guys to pay attention to this. What are some red flags that you can identify in a relationship that you can, that you can realize that perhaps are very, very harmful to when you see it, to, maybe take a step back, ask about it, think twice about jumping into that relationship. Secrecy, emotional immaturity, the inability to communicate properly, cutting off, relatives, family members, friends, lack of responsibility, lack of, awareness, social awareness. All of these things are extremely important, because getting into a relationship with the person who doesn't understand basic kind of communication, basic elements that relate to dialogue and rights and the fulfillment of rights and all these sort of things, what that's going to essentially do is going to create a very unhealthy environment for you that you will, get into the marriage with, and you will be stuck in that situation with these qualities, for the duration of that marriage. And think about that, if you have addictions that you didn't address, you have rigid thinking, meaning you have no scope to change your mind. All of these things you can imagine will cause a tremendous amount of conflict. Okay. And it's really important that we pay attention to the slide, because a lot of these things can come up. Well, they do come up very frequently, but unless you know what they are, you won't be able to prevent yourself from getting sort of caught up in that. And if you're ever in doubt, reach out. That is the best advice that I can suggest. Okay. And I want to sort of wrap it up with these resources for all of us. And I'll just briefly go over this. If you're in Northern California, NISA is a great resource it's a sort of like a shelter, for women who go through a lot of difficulty. And essentially you can reach out to them. They can provide mental health services. If you're in an abusive relationship, you need help, you can contact NISA. They're an excellent organization. They've been around for a very long time. The Family and Youth Institute also provide mental health services, but they also provide a ton of educational material. Their website is flooded with resources, studies, infographics. It is really, honestly, an excellent resource, and especially they have a divorce kit that it's actually really great, and it's a great resource to utilize. Of course, we have Wasilah Connections for our own purposes, for the purposes of therapeutic services, the religious consultation services, and a lot of the group work that we do. The group work, the single parents group work that we do, social events that we do. because of the purposes that we know that this is a challenge for a lot of families, for a lot of individuals, and it's absolutely necessary that we provide a space for that. Now, that's not the only thing that we do, but it is certainly one avenue that we have highlighted in our practice over the past few years, and we continue to provide that. And then just lastly, I wanted to introduce in Shaykh's clothing. And again, the reason why I wanted to mention this is more in relation to secret nikah and secret marriages. A lot of people have become victim more so now than they ever have in the past of these secret marriages, by religious figures, people in authority, wealthy individuals. Well, they'll use you only for sexual favors, and then after that, abandon you. All these false pretenses. So that being said, I wanted to share these resources. I thank all of you for joining us this evening and staying with us the duration of this time. Jazakumullahu khairan to everyone. Inshallah, we'll have our Q&A session now, and we'll take as many questions as we can. I do apologize. I think we'll go through kind of like a rapid fire period. I'll try to get as many as I can. Of course, this is such a sensitive topic and a very contentious one, honestly, for some. So I ask you ahead of time for forgiveness, because I don't think that I can answer all your questions with like the utmost amount of detail in this open space. But if you'd like to make a consultation, inshallah, we can certainly talk about this in more specificity. Or if you send in your emails, then maybe on a one-on-one basis, then we can address that in more detail. But for the purposes of this session, inshallah, we'll address them as they come up. But it may not be as detailed as you're expecting. So let me just get to some of the questions that I have right now. Okay.
So for the previous slide, there was quoting the hadith reference that you had, I believe.
This?
Yes.
About the story of the young woman?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You wanted did you say you wanted the quote for that or the reference for that?
The reference.
So the reference of this hadith comes in Bazar, and also Ibn Hibban mentions it in his Sahih. So Ibn Hibban and Rawahu al-Bazzar, they narrate this hadith. I have a question here. I'm going to answer this one. So it's a question about infidelity. And one of the individuals in the relationship sought help. The person claimed that they would change, but they continue to mess up and fall into infidelity. But ultimately, they separated. But one partner is being gaslit in the relationship, or she's separated, but they haven't formally divorced. So this is a very technical situation, actually. I would not prefer to answer this one in this space. There's a lot of factors here because this is very multi-layered. First and foremost, let me just say, any type of, when a person is trying to get out of a very, very toxic relationship like this, where the partner is consistently in a state of infidelity, and you've made a decision for yourself that that's not what you want, and others are kind of telling you, no, it's not that bad. No, it's okay. What are you talking about? No, it's fine. It's not that bad. Just stay. It's fine. It's fine. The thing is that this is a cycle that will never end, and people will make you feel guilty till the moon and back. But the reality is that person did a wrong, then they admitted it, and they continue to fall for it. And they realize that perhaps you're not going to make a decision, you're not going to make a move. So they realize they have an easy pass. Okay, whether it's consciously they're thinking that or subconsciously, but that's what's happening. That's why the behavior keeps happening. But I'll leave that at that because, like I said, this is very complicated, and I'd rather address that in more specificity. But in any case, yeah, we can maybe go to the next question.
Another question is there a difference in the Shafi school of thought of divorce, the steps of divorce and the steps of thoughts on divorce?
About the thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
There may be. I'm only speaking on behalf of the Hanafi madhab, and I would prefer to stick to that unless you need a reference for that, which then I can, inshallah, try to provide you a reference if you directly contact us, the Wasilah contact. Inshallah, then we can find a resource for you from a reliable Shafi'i scholar, in which, inshallah, I can get back to you about. Yeah.
Next question is, if a wife asks for divorce because the spouse is abusive and toxic in all ways, and when the husband then divorces her, putting all the blame on her that you asked for it, is the fragrance of Jannah be prohibited on her?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Basically, if the relationship was very abusive and toxic, and the wife had asked for the divorce, and the husband goes ahead and divorces her, but then puts all the blame of that on her, will the musk or the fragrance of Jannah be prohibited for her?
Because she sought a divorce?
Due to abusive and toxic relationship.
No, not at all. That's one of the reasons why you can seek a divorce. I mean, mind you, none of these things are normal things. I mean, if you're married and you're living a happy marital life, 9 times out of 10, no one's going to leave that marriage. But this is legitimate harm. This is legitimate concern for your safety, your tarbiyah, your iman, your children. I mean, there's too many factors in this to say that if you saw divorce, that you'd be prohibited from the fragrance of paradise. This is an incorrect way of looking at it. Yeah.
All right. There was a question that came in about now if the couple has been separated and have been living separately, no marital relationships have happened during that time frame of 3 months. And then the utterance of divorce comes in after those 3 months. Does the 3 months prior count, or will it have to count after the utterance?
So were they separated in the sense that they were just living separately, but no issue of divorce was given?
If the person wants to clarify on that question, I believe.
So based on that, let's just answer that way, since I'm sure we have other questions. If they were living separately, but they were not divorced formally, meaning they just said, hey, look, we need a break. You go there, I'll go there, but we didn't say anything about divorce. And they lived away from each other for 3 months or even a year. And then after that, someone issued a divorce. That 3 months before was nothing. That 3 months, 4 months, 1 year of staying away from one another, that didn't count as a time for anything. That was just two of you physically in two different locations. Your marriage was fully intact. The moment the issuance of a divorce is instituted, it's from that moment that the timer sort of ticks. Yeah.
Islamically, is it haram to take half of what husband owns in case of divorce by the law?
So according to Islamic law, there's a very specific process when it comes to inheritance and things like that. But this is separate. This is with reference to how much can a woman take after a divorce is happening. Not after. This is not inheritance money. We're talking about divorce money. And I prefer not to address this question here in this particular session, as that can get very, very technical. So of course you can address that one, inshallah, more privately.
And I will go ahead and send out, there is our website. If you go ahead and go on www.wasilahconnect.org, there is an option on the mental health service page where you can request an appointment with Sheikh Jabir to have these questions answered. The next question is, what do you suggest should a couple do? Seek out civil divorce or Sharia divorce first?
Okay, so here's what I'll say also. I would always go with the civil divorce first. And the reason for that is because it takes very long. It's much more complicated. And it's usually if both sides of both parties are open to the divorce, I would always work with the civil divorce first, only just because it makes the process easier once you have that cleared out of the way. Because if you are civilly married and you're not, and you're divorced Islamically, all that paperwork is still going to remain. All the technical stuff, it's going to cause a lot of awkwardness and uncomfortability. So it's much easier. This is my suggestion. Of course, others may have their own opinions, but I would strongly suggest to get the civil divorce initiated, started, and then, of course, that's why I'm saying if both parties are already agreeing to do the divorce, once that paperwork comes in, then you can issue the divorce right away. It'll be a very simple process.
If you have been living separated for 2 years and still cannot reconcile with each other and have filed but not completed a civil divorce, where does that leave you? Both of us haven't been able to fix our differences, married 10 years, separated too.
When you say separated, I'm assuming you don't mean actually divorced, though. You just mean physically apart.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so technically you're in limbo civilly, because once that paperwork comes in and you decide to sign it, then you're officially divorced according to the state law. However, Islamically, you haven't divorced. So you guys are separate. But here's the thing. If you ever wanted to remarry, you couldn't, right? Of course, you understand that. But currently. But But your relationship with your husband would be a very sort of separate, we're totally in our own world. We're only doing this for the kids, or I don't know, whatever the agreement is. So yes, you are actually still married, but you're separate. And then in terms of like how you want to navigate that, it's really based on your family dynamic and what you want to do in that situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it's possible to kind of remain like this and you're still, Islamically
No,
married. You're good. You're good.
yeah, that. I mean, that I'm not saying it's the best situation, but if it works out for your specific case, that's totally your discretion, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're most welcome.
We're going to take one more question as we do have to wrap this up. But there was a question about alimony that came in. And generally speaking, generally speaking, the wife has been working for majority of the time of the marriage. Most of her income, all of her income was used towards the finances so the husband could save. Now, as in the divorce, the wife is seeking the alimony. The child support, with the child support calculation, it is not enough. So an alimony or spousal support is being added in. What is the Sharia rulings on that? Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. So again, this is so with alimony, anything that deals with finance, I actually prefer not to talk about. I apologize for this. I know it sounds like I'm deferring, but the reality is that there's the reason why, and let me clarify, is that because there's a difference of opinion amongst the scholars. Also, there's a lot of case by case situations here that arise when it comes to the finances, depending on how much the finances are, what is the agreed terms, how was it written in the contracts, etc. All of these things will actually impact that decision of whether or not this is an acceptable thing to do, how much can be given, how much can be allocated, and then is it alimony in the traditional sense or alimony in another definition sense, which I've actually seen it be sort of redefined in a different way as well. I think all of these things are extremely important that it be addressed, but I just don't think that this is the best place for that. Of course, I would love to address that with the individual directly, though, inshallah. I thank everyone for your time. Thank you so much. Jazakumullahu khairan. If you have any questions, please, all the resources are there. The website, the email. Continue to send your questions in. Continue to, take a look at the Wasilah website. And inshallah, we do hope to continue to serve our community and see all of you very soon. Again, Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.